Well, we've done a couple of things here. I need to get you caught up to where we're at. Get ready to show you how to cut out a hatch in the back of your kayak here. But before we do that, I'm going to talk to you about what we've done on this combing. Obviously, you can see it's been trimmed. We've gone ahead and we've sanded all of this, and we put in that little decorative piece in the back that we said we were going to do. So let me show you how we did that, in case you do not know. Well, you're going to start out with a little block of whatever wood you're going to use. We've got sapel, or sapele here, depending on how you pronounce it. And what you need to do is scribe, just like putting your cabinets in, right? So I started out with a little block. I put it up against here, and then I scribed up against the strips that were going around, and that gives me this edge here. And once I get a good fit there, I simply take a straight edge coming out from the angles that I cut here, and I mark this piece of wood, and I cut the angles. And then once all is done, and I've got it in place, then it's just a matter of figuring out how thick the combing is here that we put in already, and scribe that onto here. And everything that I did to get this to shape was a sander. I just used the benchtop sander, and then I slid it in there, put a little epoxy on it, and let it dry. After all that was done, and that was dry, I thickened a little bit of epoxy, and I went around the entire top, and any place there was a little itty bitty opening, I went ahead and filled it, and now we've sanded it. And we're getting ready so that we're going to put some fiberglass tape all along the top of this thing. But before we do that, I want to take care of cutting the hatch, because before we put this tape on here, remember, we sanded underneath here, so there's some exposed areas under here. We need to get some epoxy on that and seal up everything that's not sealed. Now, I did sand the top of this, but I did not sand the sides of this, because remember what we just said a little while ago is don't sand things you don't need to sand, because if you're going to come back and do it again and again and again, sandpaper just tends to make things smaller and smaller and smaller, right? So I don't need to sand the sides yet. It's not getting in the way of me putting the fiberglass tape on the top. I'm just going to leave her alone. Okay. So now let's talk about the hatch here. In order to put a hatch in, it just takes nerve more than anything. There is no magic to the size and the shape of the hatch you're going to put in, but there are some things that you probably want to consider. Number one thing to consider is, where's your bulkhead? Last thing in the world you want to do is cut a hatch dead smack in the middle of your bulkhead, because that would be a problem. So I know my bulkhead stops right here. I know I want a fairly big opening, and I also know that in a kayak like this, where it's recreational, it's fairly wide and stable, that I want to be able to turn around and stick my hand in the hatch if I have to. So I don't want to put the hatch too far back, because then it becomes unusable on the water. But that's a call, and it's a call shot that you're going to have to make. Some people rather be able to stick their arm all the way up into the tip if they have to. I don't feel that need, and my arm will get all the way up to here easily enough, so I'm not worried about it. So I took a piece of heavy-duty cardboard, just a shipping box or whatever. I cut out the shape that I wanted, and then I drew a center line down the middle. Now this shape can be oval, round, diamond, can be a fleur-de-lis if you want, if you've got the patience to cut it. But what it needs to be probably is centered on the boat. Right, so the way I did that is I simply drew a line down the center of my pattern, and then I pulled the string front to back, and I centered the pattern. And then I put hot glue, I put a dollop of hot glue on all the corners, and this piece of cardboard is just glued right down to the boat. So now let me show you how we're going to cut this out. I've already cut one side here, as you saw. My general feeling is wherever you can take advantage of something, take advantage of something. So I'm going to start with back saw. And I can't do it here because it will cut into parts of the boat I don't want to cut into. But here, because I have this bulge here, I can go ahead and very gently begin where I'm going to cut. So now I have a beginning right here where I'm going to cut. Now I got to tell you, I've cut hatches with just about everything, from jigsaws to trim routers to my favorite, the multi-tool. They all have pluses and minuses. If you're going to do a pattern which has curves to it, then you know, I found that I have a little trim router that plunges down, and as long as you are very slow and very carefully, you can cut a really nice pattern out. But this is a very simple square, or close to a square, and I'm going to use the multi-tool. And once you've got a start here, it's just a matter of being slow, steady, and when you get to the tips here, it's very slow and very steady. So let me finish cutting this out, and then I'll show you how we're going to get to the sides. So you can see that you have a great deal of control if you just go slow. So now I've got a cut going from here to here and from here to here, and now I just need to cut these sides here. All right, so I can't use my saw to get it started. You can try to use a razor knife if you want, but I found if I'm just slow and steady, I know steady is just a word people use when they talk about this stuff, but steady is really important here. What you don't want to do is jump up and down as you're getting started. When it hits and it bites, you have a tendency to pull back. Unless you think it's not in the right spot, don't pull back. Just very lightly and firmly push right down on through, and that'll give you your start, all right? But before I do that, I've got the hot glue gun cooking, because what I want to do is I want to support this thing so that when I'm done cutting, I don't have to worry about how do I grab it. So I'm just going to take and put a dollop of hot glue right here in the middle. All right, so I've got the stick glued in there now. And so now it's just a matter of cutting this one out. All right, well, she's pretty much cut out, and you can see one corner is dropped here, but the other three haven't. And that's probably, it's probably fiberglass underneath holding it together. And you can't really get a direct 90-degree angle on the cut. So you're gonna have to take a razor knife and go the final distance here. Now you do have some options here. If you want this to be watertight, if you're concerned about that, or at least relatively watertight, you can use a thicker lip underneath here and use weather stripping. You know, the kind of weather stripping they sell at the store. It's about 3/4 inches wide, about 1/4 inch thick. It's rubbery, and you can put that all the way around the inside. But if you do that, you've got to drop your lip down, because when this goes to set in, if you've got a 1/4 inch strip of weather stripping there, it's going to push it up, make it sit up, right? So you're going to want to set it down about 1/4 inch, and which means you need a 1/4 inch spacer underneath here, and then your lip goes underneath that, and then your weather stripping goes on top of that, and then we can drop this right down on top of the weather stripping, and it'll be relatively watertight. If you don't see yourself as doing kayak rolls or going out in storms or anything like that, I wouldn't be overly worried about the weather tight stuff. You know, usually when I'm putting stuff in here, if I'm worried about being wet, I'll put it in Ziplocs or gig bags or something like that. And so I'm typically not overly concerned about that, but that's up to you. All right, so I'm just going to take a little bit of sandpaper, clean this up. And then we're going to mix up some clear epoxy, and we're going to go around and we're going to hit all this stuff we sanded underneath that's open. And then we'll trim this out, and we'll be well on our way to getting this thing in the water. But at least now she is starting to look like a kayak. If your kayak has a curve on the deck, you're probably going to want to use a steamer or at least some hot water and pre-bend the molding that goes around the deck hatch, because what you don't want to happen is you don't want a straight piece of hardwood to straighten out your deck hatch, and then it won't fit on your boat anymore, or at least it won't lay down flat. A couple things you should know that'll make it a little bit easier for you. I sanded this down like I'm ready to do a finished boat, because after we put the rim on around there, it gets more difficult to sand it. So it's easier. So I went over this with 80 grit paper, then I went over it with 220 grit paper, and this is effectively ready for varnish at this point. So it's got that telltale milky look to it, but don't worry about it. You can see just the places where I have a little bit of epoxy on the top and the bottom, it cleared right up again. So the milky is normal. Don't worry about that. Just be careful not to cut into the cloth as you're sanding, and then you won't as long as you have plenty of epoxy on there. And then I use clear epoxy, put some down there, clear epoxy on one half of the strip, and I just carefully clamp it on. Now I'm just gonna leave it alone to dry. Now, effectively what I did to this, I'm about to do to the boat, only on the underneath, right? So I'll paint a little bit of clear epoxy underneath, paint it on half of this, and I'll go ahead and clamp it in. On the inside lip of the hatch there, I don't read anything into those C-clamps. The only reason I used the C-clamps on the other side was simply for space. The size that I cut the hatch didn't allow me to get spring clamps or finger clamps on both sides, so I just switched over to C-clamps. Now just throwing some clear epoxy here in the combing, and you can see it's beautiful. She's gonna be pretty. And after I put the clear epoxy on, I'll get some fiberglass down, and we're probably going to leave her alone so she can settle in and dry a bit. And then we'll trim it and go ahead and put epoxy underneath all this. It should go without saying at this point, on anything that goes into the water on a regular basis, you don't want unsealed wood. So you are going to have to go back before all is said and done when you're cleaning up and seal it. Seal everything. Seal, seal, seal. Make sure water never gets to any of this. And we have found over the years that there are parts of a boat which are more susceptible to damage over time than other parts of the boat. This combing is definitely one of those parts. What's the reason for that? Well, every time you get in and out of the boat, you're leaning on it, you're pushing your paddle against it, your fishing poles are banging up against it. So the fiberglass cloth effectively gives us abrasion control, and we're going to use that abrasion control to protect this. It certainly doesn't hurt, and it certainly will help. The other thing that it will do is it will give you a lot of weather protection on these laminates going around here, right? So you should never ever have to worry about that delaminating with fiberglass over the top, which is being taken care of over the years, because every couple of years you're going to give it a light sanding and put a little bit of UV protected or spa varnish on top. All right, so I'm going to work as quickly as I can to put this all the way around the combing.